Hello everyone and welcome to Geotab's online training. Thanks for joining us today for Tuesday's talk. This is Carrie Carter and today's session is a full one. Angie is with us today and she is going to share with us and help us understand a little bit more about all of those log details that we see, those 5,000 logs a day. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Angie.
Thank you very much, Carrie. Great. So welcome, everybody. So as Carrie mentioned, we're going to go through the log details and accident data report that we see in My Geotab. Now, I know we have some customers on here, and you may have never really ventured into this area of the software, but it's good for you to know what the device is reporting and how you can view the data for a lot of different scenarios. Now, I'll show you how I got into this particular section here that we're looking at right now. As you can see, my side panel is a little bit smaller, but I still have my icons. I'm just going to expand that a bit up here. So to get into the log details and accident data, you would simply just go to Activity, and then you would go into View Accident and Log Data. And that's exactly where I'm looking at right now. Now this report, because it is a lot of data, you can really only run it for one vehicle at a time. So when we go into our options, you can see we have the similar date period times that we can do. We can do yesterday, today. We can even do our custom time frame as well. We can even narrow it down to a specific hour if we know that something happened at that time. And then we'll only get the logs for that time frame. And then you can search for your vehicle from your list here. We do have the option if you do have a device, maybe it's an accident that you want to look at the data and it's something that happened 6 months ago. And since then, you know, the device was probably, or the vehicle was probably written off, the device may have been made historic in the database. You do have the ability to run the report on that historic information. Okay, so I'm just going to go through a couple of different things that we can see in the log details with a couple of different vehicles. So to start, I'm just going to look at a standard vehicle and how it starts off from midnight. And I probably won't go through the entire day because I'm sure the vehicle probably has quite a few trips. But I'm just going to kind of explain how the heartbeats show up and what it looks like when a trip starts and what the data looks like when it starts to come through. Okay, so as you can see right off the bat, and I hope you can see the colors, we do have a couple of logs here that are shown up as green, and those are our GPS records. Everything else outside of that is just a standard white background. It's just a better visualization that we can see which ones are going to give us that speed information. Okay, so we're looking at midnight, and we can see here we've got a GPS record, and we've got quite a bit of information in here that doesn't really make a lot of sense. You can see the record type is not a GPS record, it's a debug record. So most of the time when you see a debug record, it's not really necessary that you try and figure out what it means. It's mainly for our engineers on our side here to be able to troubleshoot further if something happens with the device. We can really look at the detailed information. But what you'll notice, let me just go to 1203. 1203, I have my GPS record. I actually do see something pretty interesting on the debug record here, which is telling me that there is a successful connection with the modem. Pretty cool. So we know that we have a GPS record, modem connection success, and that is actually a heartbeat. Now we heartbeat every 30 minutes up for the first 23 hours or 24 hours, and then we do it every 24 hours after that, once. So you can see at 1203, we have a message here telling us that this is the GPS, we've got a connection to the modem, and then some other debug information. And then you can see it doesn't do it again until another 30 minutes. So we're going to see that as I scroll through here. Every 30 minutes I'm going to see this GPS record followed by these connection information, and it's really just the device telling us that it's okay, it's still communicating with the server, there's nothing, it's not unplugged, it's able to connect to the cell network and then to our servers. So I don't think that this vehicle drives at all in the middle of the night, so I'm going to actually just scroll through here until we actually start to see a trip. So don't worry if I'm going too fast here. we're not really going to see too much in the middle of the night. 6:33, we see we've got our heartbeat. And then you can see at 7:01, we've got some other information starting to come through here. We've got a cranking voltage of 12.54. And if I scroll down a little bit more, I'm getting more cranking voltages and more cranking voltages. So we know now, because it's a little bit under that 30-minute mark, it actually means that something else is happening in the vehicle. So cranking voltage means that they are cranking the ignition over, they're cranking the engine over, and we're able to see what that voltage is when they do that. And you're always going to see quite a few cranking voltages whenever they start the engine, and we will log every single one of those voltages. Now normally, you can see this is 8.96. When it comes to cranking voltages, it will drop pretty low, but nothing really to be concerned about if we say 8.96. I think if we see maybe a 6 or a 5, that's a pretty big issue. Whenever we're looking at battery issues at a high level, it's the telematics device voltage that you're looking at. If that drops below, I say 9 volts, maybe even 8 volts, then, and then on a consistent basis, then we may actually start to see that there's something happening with the battery. All right, so it's letting us know here we have an acceleration log. So you can see here it's giving us the accelerometer values, and this is pretty straightforward for if they're just sitting there. I won't go into detail about g-forces and the values. This is meant to be just kind of a high level on what we see in the logs. So we can see here that we've got an accelerometer value, and then we can actually, it's telling us that there's 0 engine RPM, but it also tells us here that it was an RPM-based ignition, which means that our device detected RPMs on the vehicle, and it's now considered an RPM-based ignition. Some other pretty neat stuff that we can see, and this is, you can see it's all within the same second. So we're getting lots of data here just from the beginning. We know that it's an OBD type of vehicle. We're actually getting fuel used on this vehicle, and you can see this is actually total fuel used since the telematics device install. So we can see it's a pretty hefty number there. If I keep on scrolling down here, I can now see total fuel used while idling since the install. And then this log here is just letting us know that the vehicle is active, meaning that it's on, it's idling, or driving. And once again, you can see we're still looking at the same second. Now, after all of the cranking voltage and some of the data coming through, we can see that it's telling us, yes, we have detected that the ignition is in fact on because we saw that RPM-based ignition. Still seeing some cranking voltages here. Now we actually start to see an RPM of 976, and here's where we see that telematics device voltage, which is essentially the voltage of the battery in the vehicle. Okay, so that's 13.36. That's a perfectly normal voltage for us to see. Now this vehicle here actually gets gear position, which is pretty cool. Not every vehicle can get it, but we're actually seeing it more and more on newer vehicles as they come out. -1 means reverse, so you can see that he had his RPM of 976, which he's going 2 kilometers an hour. He's in reverse, so we can kind of visualize the movement of the vehicle. So he puts it into reverse, he goes 2 kilometers an hour, and then if we scroll down a little bit more, actually we can see that we're getting engine coolant temperature off this vehicle as well. Here we go. So we can see that he's now kind of stopped, he's out of reverse, and then he's going to start driving again. So now we can actually see these GPS records where he's increasing in his speed, he's starting to drive now. So I'll just scroll a little bit faster through the trip itself, but as you can see, we can see the fluctuations in speed, exactly how fast he's going. We're seeing some more engine coolant temperature logs, and here's some more RPM logs, which makes sense for around the speed for us to see. We've got an acceleration log again, so it's just letting us know the status of the vehicle. Maybe he made a slight little turn or a brake, which would make sense because we can see the speed went from 20 kilometers an hour to 0. So it sounds like he came up to maybe a little bit of a harsh stop. I'm not too sure. Okay, so I'm just going to go through this trip here, and I want to get to the bottom. Okay. Here we go. So we can see here that the vehicle started to slow down, got to 4 and then 0. And so these logs here, you can see the time. So it's actually a few minutes that the vehicle is sitting there with 0 kilometers an hour. And we actually don't have an ignition log around here. So this vehicle is actually sitting there idling. And then we see right here a 0 for ignition, meaning ignition off. So they've stopped, they idled for a couple of minutes, and then they ignition the vehicle off. So that's just kind of how you can look at a valid trip information. Now, if we were getting odometer on the vehicle, we would get the odometer at the beginning and the end of the trip as well. This particular vehicle isn't giving us that odometer, but that's perfectly fine. Now, you may have some vehicles that don't give you the exact information that we've seen in this trip. They actually may give a lot more. One of the examples I'm going to go through is seatbelt data. We didn't see any seatbelt data on this vehicle, but the next example I'm going to go through is actually just showing you how you can see if the seatbelt data looks valid. We get a lot of questions where maybe there's one vehicle that's broken a whole bunch of seatbelt exceptions out of nowhere, and the questions start coming up, is the data valid? There are ways that you can actually look at the data yourself and maybe just look at one trip and see if the information makes sense to you from a logical, how you would put your seatbelt on and off during a trip. All right, this is the one where I wanted to show you a two-wire based ignition. So you remember I mentioned RPM-based ignition. So that was because we were able to detect engine data on the vehicle, and we could tell that there was an increase in the RPMs, and we can determine that it is an RPM-based ignition. This vehicle here is actually coming up as a two-wire based ignition. Now what that means is a couple of things. It could be installed with a 2- or 3-wire harness, meaning that it's not connected into the OBD or Deutsch port, so it's not getting any engine data. Or it could be that there's something happening with the vehicle voltage or battery issues or something along those lines, which actually is what's happening with this vehicle here. This is one of our coworkers' vehicles, and it's in the shop right now because there's something happening with the vehicle itself that was causing it to show up as a two-wire based ignition. So it's pretty interesting to be able to see that log come through, so you can determine, maybe all of a sudden the vehicle stops reporting any engine data. Check the log details. Did we start seeing two-wire based ignitions? If so, something could be happening with that vehicle and may need to go into the shop. Now, this one here is actually, I wanted to cover accelerometer a little bit, not too detailed on the G-forces, but there can be times where if the device is not installed securely, maybe it's with a harness and it was self-installed or something along those lines, and it wasn't secured onto the vehicle itself. Maybe we've seen in the past where the harness is plugged into the port and then the device is plugged in the other end, and it's kind of just left dangling. Because there's an accelerometer in the device, you're going to start seeing a whole bunch of accelerometer logs, and we actually have a system in place that if we see too many logs, we will disable the accelerometer because of the amount of data that comes through. And incidentally, when you have an install like that and you have rules turned on for harsh braking, acceleration, or cornering, you will most likely see that that vehicle that has that type of install is probably breaking all those rules left, right, and center, probably has the highest incident count from anybody else out there. That is a first, good indicator that something could be happening with the install, but we can actually look at the details to see if we disable the accelerometer because we're seeing a lot of those logs. So we do actually put a flag in when we do disable the accelerometer. So I'm just going to do Control F again, and I'm just going to look for the word accelerometer. And you can see it's a red line here, which means it's not something good. So we can see here that it's an engine fault record, and it's saying that the accelerometer was disabled due to excessive data. And then we even give you a little bit of advice. The device needs reinstallation. And you can see what caused this log to happen. If I scroll up, I can see all these acceleration logs, and there are quite a few of them. And more, and more, and more. and more. So right away you can see, okay, that makes sense. I can see why they disabled the accelerometer because of all of this stuff coming through. And you can see it was actually in the middle of a trip that we started to see this. So who knows, maybe the device was kicked and it got knocked loose and started waving around in the car. Not sure of this particular scenario of what exactly happened. This is one of our internal devices. We could have just been doing testing as well. But you can see here that it definitely, there's definitely something going on here, and you would need to take a look at the install of the device itself. So I did mention that cranking voltages, not a big concern if that drops a little low, but when you're looking at the telematics device voltage, if that drops really low, there's possibly an issue with the battery in the vehicle. But we will also flag a battery issue on the log details. So if I just did a Control F and started typing battery and it found it already, and you can see once again it is that red bar, something bad has happened. Engine fault record, so it's telling us there's a fault with the vehicle. Warning, the battery voltage has low voltage. And if I scroll up at some of these battery voltage logs, these ones don't look too bad. Actually, I think it was below that I noticed it. Where was it? Here we go. So we're seeing battery voltages of 7, 8. 7s are a little bit of an iffy situation for us. That's when we say, okay, we should probably just send a flag that something could be happening with the battery. And the cool thing with the log details is that battery warning that we got, we can actually create a rule based on that warning. So anything that comes through as a record, not everything, not these debugs, but pretty much everything in this log details report that comes through can be turned into a rule. So you could then turn on your real-time notifications if you want to know when a vehicle has a low battery. Probably want to know right away if a vehicle has a low battery. You may want to know at the end of the day, which is perfectly fine. You can set up a report to be scheduled on a daily or weekly basis. But it's pretty cool that we have the ability to take a look and let you know, be a little bit more proactive, that there's a possible issue with this battery and you should probably get it into the shop before it gets really low and it dies on the driver. So we found a vehicle that's given us some seatbelt data, so we'll be able to validate if it looks good or not. There we go. Okay, so once again, I'm just going to make that smaller. I can do my Control F and look for seat, and we get some information here. Okay, so let me just scroll up a bit here. So this is probably the beginning of a trip. And here it is. So you see here that it says driver seatbelt 1 equals unbuckled. So 1 will equal unbuckled. 0 will mean that it's buckled. But you can see that this log says -1. The reason why we've done this, it's essentially a reset of the seatbelt data. So in the past, we didn't have this reset, and we found that maybe the last log on a vehicle before it was unplugged was unbuckled, and then it was plugged into another vehicle that no longer got seatbelt data. And if there were rules turned on, then it would still kind of hold on to that unbuckled data, and it would look like this vehicle is breaking the rule all the time. But when you looked at the data, recent data, you wouldn't see any seatbelt data, and it would be a little bit confusing. So what we've done is we've turned on this reset. So at the beginning of the trip and at the end of I think it's just at the beginning of the trip, it will do a reset of the seatbelt data. So we want to just kind of wipe the slate clean. We're just going to say there's not necessarily that it's buckled or unbuckled. We're just essentially waiting to find out what the status of the seatbelt is. We can see here that it's on its reset. We've got our OBD protocol detection. This vehicle is actually giving us odometer, which is great to see. And let me just scroll down here. We're getting all of our fuel data. We now know what the seatbelt status is, which is unbuckled, which is normal at the beginning of a trip when you start your ignition. Sometimes I think I buckle my seatbelt before I start the ignition. I don't even know what I do. But you can see that this person started the ignition. He's got it unbuckled, and you can see there's the ignition log right there. And as we scroll through, we've got our cranking voltage again. See another seatbelt log here. So we can see he's now got it at 0, which means that he's buckled his seatbelt. and which means we should start to see him driving, which we do. He put it into reverse, he's got his speeds, and then he starts driving his vehicle. We don't see another seatbelt log in between all of that, so we know that the last log we saw was that his seatbelt was buckled, which means he's driving with a seatbelt buckled. And if we go through the trip, and I'm going a little bit fast, but I'm mainly looking for the speeds and to see if there's another seatbelt log. I could do my Control F to find the next log, but if I'm trying to validate the seatbelt data, I really kind of want to go through this one particular trip with a fine-tooth comb, if you will. So I'm just going to scroll through here and take a look at this trip data. Everything looks normal so far. I'm not seeing that he's unbuckled his seatbelt at all. We've still got RPMs and we've got some speeds. We can see that he's gone down in speed to 0. Well, he's gone back up again. But he didn't unbuckle his seatbelt here, which is good to see. He looks like he was just idling maybe at a stop sign or stoplight, and then he's driving again. Here's where now I probably would do my seatbelt look because it looks like it's a long trip. This is the one from the morning. This is the buckled at the beginning of the trip, which is at 8:35:01 a.m. And if I click the next one, I've got unbuckled at 8:43. There we go. So it looked like it was a long trip. It wasn't actually long in duration, just lots of information was coming through. So you can see here that he had a speed at 2 kilometers an hour. He's unbuckled his seatbelt. His speed's at 0. I don't see an ignition log right now, so he's sitting there idling. And then we see ignition off. So that in itself looks like the seatbelt data is working perfectly fine as far as from our end and from a logical perspective of how somebody would wear their seatbelt. If you do notice all of a sudden there's a seatbelt unbuckled log in the middle of a trip and he's going high speeds, who knows, maybe he's leaned over to get his coffee that spilled over on the next seat or something like that. It's definitely good to look at a couple of trips just to make sure that we are consistently seeing good data. But most of the time we can get pretty good information from the vehicles out there as far as seatbelt data goes. Now the last thing I wanted to point out, which I haven't yet, is these buttons that we're seeing on the right-hand side here. So all of these records can be viewed on the map. So we know exactly where they were when any of these things happen. So if I look at this unbuckled log and I click on the magnifying glass, it's going to bring me to the trip's history, and it's zoomed into where that unbuckled log was. And if I just zoom out, makes sense. So it looks like it was actually when they pulled into a location and they unbuckled their seatbelt to get out of the car. So it's great to be able to not only see the data, but sometimes, you know, I'm a little bit more of a visual person. I want to know where they were, what exactly, I want the full picture of what happened if I'm really looking at detailed information. So we have that option to view it on the map. I will pass it over to Carrie if there's any questions.
Thank you. I'm looking here, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to say that, Ange, thank you so much for enlightening us here. I think it was great to understand all of this, and you can take it back and play with it. As I mentioned before, about 5,000 logs is not outrageous to have in a day. Certainly if you're a delivery vehicle or something that's out there all day driving, 5,000 to 10,000 logs can happen. So it's a lot of data to go through, and I think Ange has given us some insight into that. So having said that, next week we are back with accident data, and Jordan's going to take us into that and hopefully help you reconstruct an accident and give you a little bit of insight into that. So I thank everyone for coming and joining us, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.